Okay, this next lesson is focusing on the migration of the Mormons and the success of their settlement. So this lesson goes into two parts. Firstly, we're going to look at who the Mormons were, look at their reasoning for needing to migrate, looking at how they migrated, and looking at why they were successful in their overall migration. So this is the specification of the exam, and we are now currently, if you look at point 2, we're looking at bullet point 2. It's only a really small part, but actually this is such a big part because this actually came up in last year's GCSE as a narrative account question. So it shows you that even the smallest parts on this specification could be exam questions. So that should make you aware of just how important every lesson is. So who were the Mormons? So the Mormons were another group who headed west. They were a religious group, and they were created by a man called Joseph Smith. Now, Joseph Smith claimed that an angel, he had this religious vision that an angel told him the whereabouts of 2 buried plates. He dug them up, translated them, and became known as the Book of Mormon. Now, Joseph Smith was credited for creating this new religion, and the Mormons became a following, a religious following. And what we need to understand is what they believed in, how they travelled around America. More importantly, why were they persecuted by so many people, which led to their migration to Great Salt Lake. So, the Mormons settled in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. I'm going to give you a way to remember that later. But each time faced hostility and had to leave. Hostility means anger. This was because they followed polygamy, the belief that you could have more than one wife, and a lot of the Christian population didn't agree with this. On top of this, the Mormons were really rich, and people were incredibly jealous of them. Wherever they went, they were wealthy, and people didn't like the fact that they were trying to take over certain areas. Now, what we need to understand is that the Mormons were forced out of areas of America. And it got to the point where the Mormons needed to find a new area to settle where they could still continue to follow their religious beliefs. Now, moving to the west, the Mormons tried to settle in lots of places. However, everywhere they went, they faced anger. So Joseph Smith and the Mormons tried to set up a Mormon state in Nauvoo in Illinois. While the Mormons were in Illinois, Joseph Smith was murdered by a group of people who hated the Mormons. Now, Joseph Smith tried to enforce the Mormons onto this area. They took over key areas like the printing press within Illinois. And this led to a vigilant group, a group that wanted to remove the Mormons, and it led to the death of Joseph Smith. The new leader after Joseph Smith was a man called Brigham Young. And he decided the Mormons should move west to the Great Salt Lake Valley, an area which they would not face religious anger. And the reason for this was because Great Salt Lake was not part of the United States. And it was an important reason in Young's choice. Because Great Salt Lake wasn't directed and enforced by Christianity, the Great Salt Lake was going to be an area that they could settle without hostility. However, what needs to be understood is that Great Salt Lake was desert land. So it would be an area where, if they were successful to migrating, would be very difficult to settle on and create an area where they could live on for a long time. It says there at the bottom, why would it be important to be outside of the USA? Oh, simple. They wouldn't face as much hostility if they weren't in American settled territory. Where did the Mormons move to? So this is a good way of remembering it. King. So Kirtland, Ohio, 1831 to 37. Independence, Missouri, 1837 to 38. Nauvoo in Illinois in 1838 to 46. And then Great Salt Lake in 1846 onwards. Now, King is a good way of remembering it. Now, to be honest, I don't think you need to know the first two. It's just nice to always have an understanding of the context of where the Mormons have come from, where they have been, and why they had to move. So let's look at the journey. So Joseph Smith has been murdered in Illinois and the new leader, Brigham Young, takes over. Then they need to start the logistical planning of moving west. So the Mormons' journey west took an immense amount of planning, which is going to. Remember, in previous lessons where we looked at the Oregon Trail, it's important that you understand that the journey from east to west took a significant amount of planning. If you didn't get it right, you'd end up like the Donner Party. And we all know what happened there. Now, Brigham Young and the Mormons reached Omaha in Nebraska. And when they reached there, it was around, I think it was June, they reached Omaha. And Brigham Young decided that June was too late to start their migration to Great Salt Lake. So he decided to spend the winter in Omaha, Nebraska, where they set up winter quarters. Now, if you have a look at that small picture there at the bottom, this is what the Mormons would have set up, winter quarters where they would have stayed. And the key decision there is that Brigham Young said that they would leave Omaha when the weather conditions were right, so that they could be successful in their migration. So, next bit. After the winter had passed, in April of 1847, an advanced party of 150 Mormons set out to mark the way for the rest of the Mormons. So Brigham Young and 150 advanced party set off from Omaha, Nebraska, from the winter quarters, and they set off and located the water supplies, they planted crops, they constructed fords across some rivers to make it easier to cross. Bearing in mind they left in April, by July they arrived at Salt Lake Valley. If you have a look at the map here, okay, this was where Illinois was. Then they went to winter quarters and arrived there in June 1846, but decided to stay there because of the winter. And then in April 1847, the advance party did this journey here to Salt Lake and set out the journey so the people behind them could reach there safely. So in July, after the Mormons had arrived, the 150 advance party, another 1,500 Mormons set off. Young set them up so this bigger group behind them could not fail. He split them up into manageable groups. Each group had a leader. Each group had sets of skills. They were all taught how to sleep in a circle with their wagons. They followed exactly the same route as Brigham Young, which had been mapped out for them, which had been made basically foolproof. Okay, July, they set off. They arrived in August. That is a really short journey. Bear in mind, the first 150 people took 3 months to do it. That was a much easier journey. And this route came to be known as the Mormon Trail. After the journey had been done and set out, between the years of 1847 and 1869, 70,000 Mormons did the journey, and they settled in Great Salt Lake. This became a Mormon settlement. It became an area where Mormons settled because they didn't face the anger and the hostility that had faced them in the previous 3 areas where they had been since Joseph Smith dug up the golden plates and created the Book of Mormon. So what you've got here is a much more detailed grid of information. Now what we've got is we've got the push factors and the pull factors. I'm going to go through some of this briefly. Remember, you don't need to know it all for the exam because it's not all in the syllabus. Again, it's just good historian practice to have that contextual knowledge. So reasons why they headed west. First of all, problems in the east. So in Kirtland, Ohio, Joseph Smith claimed to be a prophet and said the Mormons were God's chosen people. They were successful. Others were jealous. But in 1837, remember, don't forget, in the east, banks collapsed. And in 1837, the Mormon bank collapsed and many people lost their savings. So they moved to try and start again. In Independence, Missouri, the Mormons were anti-slavery in a slave-owning state. And the Mormons were not unfriendly towards the Indians. So there was a lot of anger towards them. They were anti-slavery in a slave-owning state, so people would have wondered why they had this thought. So they had to move on again. In Nauvoo, in Illinois, Joseph Smith announced that men could have more than one wife. Non-Mormons thought this was a sin. Rioters murdered their leader, Joseph Smith, so it meant that they had to move on. And this is where Brigham Young said that God had called the Mormons to migrate to Salt Lake Valley. It was outside the US, and it was a way in which they could avoid the significant persecution. So the journey goes in two stages. First of all, leaving Nauvoo, Illinois and reaching Omaha, where they set up the winter quarters until the following spring. By April 1847, that's when the advance party set out. And once they were over the South Pass, this advance party took the same route as the Donner Party, but they set things out. They made it easy for the people behind them to follow it. And then that's the information we've looked at previously. But how did Brigham Young ensure they were successful? So why was the migration so successful? If you got a question in the exam saying, explain the importance of Brigham Young to the migration to Great Salt Lake, Brigham Young's leadership and planning were vital. Before leaving Illinois, he organised a count of people and wagons to plan the logistics. He worked out what each person would need to survive to make sure they didn't go down the same route as the Donner Party. Young discussed and talked with trail guides and explorers to find out as much he could about Great Salt Lake Valley, so that when he got there, they could be successful. The advance party travelled on the north side of the Platte River to avoid hostility from other migrants, and they were supplied with food, and they were even supplied with a boat to help with river crossings. They signposted the way so that those that followed knew the clean water sources. They set up river crossings and planted crops along the way to help feed the people behind them. They were separated into groups. Young was very strict with his discipline, so there weren't any arguments. They were sort of united by the vision and concept of God. Migrants were taught to form wagons into a circle for night safety, and resting places were planned so that the livestock did not get too exhausted. So once you got to Great Salt Lake, it was then that challenge of settlement. How did Brigham Young and the Mormons manage to survive in a desert state? So first of all, it was harsh. It was an arid landscape. The lake was salty, and the land around it was poor to grow crops on. So they were successful because they had one central plan under the strict control of Brigham Young and church leaders. The Mormons, who were in Great Salt Lake, saw Brigham Young as God's prophet, so they did everything he said. The Mormons built an irrigation system to water the crops. This needed large numbers of people, and Young ensured that the irrigation system was absolutely vital to their overall success. New settlements were planned around Great Salt Lake to produce particular products that the Mormons needed, such as food crops, minerals, and timber. And he sent out a mix of people with the skills for each settlement needed, so to make sure that other things were made in different settlements around Great Salt Lake and then sent to him centrally, including water. So new settlements were set up where there was a more reliable water supply, and products such as veg, flour, timber, and metals from the settlements were brought back to Salt Lake, which was founded by Brigham Young. It allows to create that economy, that society. It's got trade, it's got money, it's got goods, and it allows the Mormons to successfully survive Great Salt Lake. So, why are we looking at this? The purpose of this is to, well, first of all, as a revision task, do these 4 questions before I get ahead of myself. There are many reasons why the Mormons chose to move west. For example, the Mormons were successful in their migration for many reasons. For example, the Mormons were able to create a settlement because Brigham Young was important to the success. Because, if you want to pause it and complete this would help you hugely in understanding or revisiting the Mormons. So, one of the most difficult questions that people believe in the exam is the narrative account question. Now, this is a question that's been met with either like or dislike. It's a bit of a Marmite question. People either love this question or they hate it. So it's write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Mormon migration in the years 1846 to 1847. You may use the following. To be honest, I think the best thing to do for this question is ignore the stimulus points. They might confuse you. The point of this question is to write an account which is in chronological order, which has explanation throughout. It needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. You are telling me the story of the Mormon migration with explanation of what each event led to. Key things. Number one, stick to 3 paragraphs. I'm going to show you an example in a minute that got 8 out of 8. Number two, make sure you keep within the date. So 1846 to 1847, if you started barking on about Kirtland, Ohio, then you won't have any luck. So what I want you to do is, using this lesson, create a flow chart of what happened. The first 2 events, you could say in 1846, the Mormons were forced from Illinois. This was because their beliefs in polygamy. It was decided by Brigham Young they would go to Great Salt Lake. This led to, that's the one phrase that you need to keep using in this question to be able to be successful. This led to the Mormons leaving and going to Omaha in June 1846. Boom, we've got the date. The Mormons arrived in Omaha. However, their leader, Brigham Young, decided it was not the right time to leave due to the threat of winter. So the Mormons stayed in Omaha in winter quarters, ready for the right weather conditions to be successful. Your then job is to say, what did that lead to? So obviously the next event you could talk about is in April 1847, when Brigham Young and the 150 Mormons set off on the advance party. Before you talk about that, you could talk about what Brigham Young did before he set off to make sure the other Mormons were going to be okay. This is an example. Now, the magic about this response is actually a whole paragraph of it is totally irrelevant. I actually got rid of that. This was actually 3 paragraphs, but one of the paragraphs spoke about the settlement. That's wrong, because the question asks you just about migration. So this question is a really great example of what a narrative account question needs. I'm not going to read it all, but what I am going to do is I'm going to point out the analytical phrases. So the first event of Mormon migration was the Mormons being pushed out of their town in 1846. They were a religious group who practiced polygamy. This was discriminated against and not normal, wasn't God's plan for America. The prejudice against Mormons led to them feeling unwelcome, and as a consequence, the Mormons decided to leave and settle somewhere else. The Mormons chose Salt Lake Valley as it has one of the only places that wouldn't be discriminated against. However, due to the Mormons being pushed out, they only had to leave early, than expected during winter. This event led to earlier travel to Salt Lake Valley. I mean, it's not historically fully accurate, but it does enough. Remember, the examiners are looking at you being successful, not picking every little mistake you make. You're sitting in really stressed conditions, they understand that. A second event was the journey to Salt Lake Valley led by Brigham Young. He was a well-organised and prepared man. He first set up winter quarters so they wouldn't have to travel during winter and risk death. He also sent out advance party to mark water sources and plant crops, so if they ran out of food, it wouldn't be an issue. Lastly, he split up groups in equal age ranges, skills, and each group had one leader to avoid confusion. As a result, the Mormons successfully arrived in Salt Lake Valley, avoiding all mistakes the Donner Party made. This event led to the creation of Salt Lake City due to the success of Brigham Young. Tells me the story. It uses 6 analytical phrases, and that got 8 out of 8 in the GCSE exam. So we've gone through the events of the Mormons. If you want to practice writing your own narrative account question, the more you do, the better. But this touches upon that point of making sure that you know who they were, why they moved, where they moved, how they got there, and how they settled.